Hi everyone, this is Miriam Davidovich. I'm a partner at Roshem Ventures in Israel, and I'm here today for a master class with Dorit. She is the COO and co-founder of Change Finance, headquartered in Denver, Colorado as a public benefit corporation. And I will let her share her personal and career journey with us and share some very valuable insights on redesigning financial products for a post-COVID future with myself and Metabo, who is our media and impact manager at Roshem Impact. Dorit, can you please start and share your career journey with us?
Sure, Miriam, I'm really happy to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me. Really, my career has been anything but linear. So I definitely did not start in impact. I did not start in finance, which means you don't have to either. I started my career in technology and IT, coming out of graduate school with a master's degree in computer science. I walked into my first job because the one class I liked in grad school, a friend of that professor crafted a position just for me, knowing I was coming out of school. I stepped into that position, doing work, trying to help people develop software better, software that was more responsive to the needs of its users. I ended up spending 7 years at that company in sort of increasingly responsible positions, working on software development, managing large-scale software projects. That was great. I liked the work I was doing. It was challenging, but also eventually I felt like I'd hit a little bit of a ceiling in terms of my career progression and started to feel a little bit as though I was running on a treadmill, making people at the top wealthier without necessarily having any impact. I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't have a good way to articulate that then. And that meant I didn't really know what I wanted to do next. But I did know how to apply to school. So I went to business school, figuring I would probably go into management consulting, something like that. That would give me breadth of experience. I didn't end up doing that. Life has a funny way of sending you in different directions. I met my husband and got married. He was headed to China, so I followed him to China. Didn't know how to change careers in a place I didn't know anybody and didn't know the language. So I ended up staying in technology for another year or so while we were in China for the first time. But in a much smaller company, so getting some experience in early stage kind of startup at a kind of higher level position, running a division. Came back at the worst point in the financial crisis in 2009. Knowing I was only going to be staying at my next location in Boston, Massachusetts for a year or a bit. So I, rather than taking a full-time job, which were hard to come by, did some freelance consulting before moving down to Washington, D.C., where we settled. I connected with a fellow alum from my very small liberal arts school who had founded a fabulous program working with early stage social enterprises in Latin America, needing somebody else to come on board. I jumped in with both feet and didn't really look back, and that was really my first introduction to impact investing and the impact ecosystem. So we worked with companies primarily on access to capital and investor readiness. So I helped build that program as COO at Agora Partnerships over several years until it came time to move back to China. My husband had an assignment at the U.S. Embassy there, so I followed him there and took a position at the U.S. Embassy working on environmental policy and energy policy out of the embassy. So I got my feet wet a little bit in the government and policy sector before coming back to the United States, just as my co-founders at Change Finance were formulating the plan for this company and beginning to seek the initial startup capital. So I dove in once again, kind of a little bit blind. First, as an investor, I wrote the first check to help fund the company. And then pretty quickly, when it became clear they needed somebody with broad experience to help with operations, I joined the team, and the rest is history. So we've been at it for about 4 years. In terms of looking at where your journey can take you, follow the possibility and don't be afraid to jump. At least that's what's worked for me.
You know, the comprehension, you know, how long did it, you know, perhaps take for you to transition from your original, you know, blueprint life plan to your destiny and where you are?
That's a great question. I got my very first taste of some of the language in business school. In fact, I can remember, I don't know the name of the article, it might have been in The Economist for a guess. I can remember the very first article that I read that was sort of in this space. It was about a company that was making drinking straws that would filter water as somebody drank through them. And the idea was that they could sell these. Probably they were going to sell them to NGOs who would distribute them in Africa to people who didn't have access to clean drinking water. But what was revolutionary and what the focus of the article is that they were not themselves a nonprofit, that they saw a for-profit business model, and the article was really framed around that for-profit business model and the idea that you could develop a business and use a business as a force for good. So I remember it so clearly. It was really my first exposure to the idea that business itself could be a force for good in the world, and that you could design businesses with impact in mind. And it didn't have all the jargon. Not all the jargon even existed then. It was very much still emerging. In some ways, it's still emerging today. We don't really have a total agreement today on impact investing. Some people still define it kind of more narrowly as early stage startup investing, and some people apply it kind of across the spectrum to all different asset classes. So I think that the jargon even now is still developing. But that opened my eyes, and you know, it didn't make the career transition instantly because it took time to develop, and really there still wasn't a huge industry. It was very much still an emerging industry, but I did do a little bit of work in graduate school. I remember doing a project on microfinance for a class. There was the beginnings of a kind of a social enterprise club. There wasn't the kind of curriculum that many business schools have now, but there were kind of the early rumblings of interest and access. So I took advantage of what I could learn then. And I, you know, the next sort of big opportunity moment for me came in that connection. I mentioned that the position I took at Agora Partnerships came about as a connection to a fellow alum who had founded the organization. That came about through a conversation I had with somebody from the alumni office whose job is, you know, to keep alumni connected and get them to engage with the school. And she came to have coffee with me, I think, when I moved down to Washington, D.C., and I was telling her, not that articulately really, because I still didn't have all the language about what I thought I wanted to do next. And she said, I think I know the person you need to meet, and she made the connection. And once I got my feet on the ground in a job in the space, I started to learn. We were all still learning. You know, we were the first program doing the kind of work that Rosham is doing now in South Africa and in other places around the world, working with early stage entrepreneurs. And we were doing that kind of work in Latin America. And we were the first program doing that in Latin America. And so very much building the language and contributing to building the jargon. So it's an ongoing process. So I was learning and building as I went. And I think there's still room to do that today because we're still very much a growing, developing field.
I'm sure that Miriam has shared with you that I'm part of a project that we're working on here in South Africa. We've coined it She Generates. I wanna, talk to you about how your role as a woman in the industry, have you found your position, your role, and how has it been, being, inverted commas, one of the few women who are in technology and impact investing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have been really lucky, I think, in my career, not to have experienced a lot of really overt sexism. That doesn't mean it's not there, certainly in more subtle ways. As an example, coming out of grad school into that first job, in those days there really wasn't much in the way of career support or guidance, I think, for anybody coming out of those kinds of programs, and certainly not for women. I was a beneficiary in graduate school of a fellowship that was specifically designed to encourage more women in STEM fields. So I benefited in that respect. But coming out, I had no guidance about how to find a job, or certainly what to do once I had been given a job offer. So I did no negotiating, which is typical of women in all professions. They're much less likely to negotiate salary and benefits than men are. And I was then really lucky. A year or so later, my first boss left. And the man who took over his position was retired Navy, and there were certainly some cultural differences that were challenging to navigate. But one thing that I really benefited from, that I think he brought in probably from that military background, was he had a real commitment to taking care of the people that worked for him. And just about the time he took over the team, the company instituted a policy to reevaluate salaries, not having anything to do at all with gender, but because the company was located just outside of Silicon Valley, and they were losing a lot of people to Silicon Valley where salaries were higher. And the way that the program worked was any manager who felt that they had employees who were underpaid relative to the market could go and make a case for why that person on their staff should get paid more. Well, he got me an 18% raise, which is a really big raise to get all at one time. And I don't think that salaries were 18% below market. I think that they were 5%. Or maybe 10% below market. I think the rest of that difference was a gender difference.
Particularly in developing industries like either technology or impact investing, it's what I'd want to call, imposter syndrome for women. Sometimes, it's like you always have to prove that you're smart, that you're a logical, strategic thinker. So often than not, one always feels like, maybe I'm not even worth it. Let me just, sit this one down. So I just want to touch on the human factor of solution finding. Are we just essentially, even with impact investing as a strategy, a competitive strategy, are we just looking at just having, solutions that are obviously, financial and socially beneficial, but also then, I guess my question is, I'm trying to ask where the human touch, is it still necessary in the fourth industrial revolution, or we can just mandate and get, automated responses with everything that we need?
I think the human touch is absolutely essential, because at heart, we are people. And when we lose sight of the fact that we're dealing with people, and that ultimately we are people, I think that's where the world starts to fall apart. And so over the last couple of months at Change Finance, we have spent a lot of time focused on articulating our core values as we get ready to start taking the first steps in expanding our team. We thought it was really important to have a really clear idea of who we are as a company, who we want to be as a company, how we want to grow. And whole human became the top of our list. And by that we mean we recognize that people are whole humans. They have lives outside of work. It's not real to say we check those lives at the door when we come into the office, because if something's going on in our lives outside of work, it affects us whether we want it to or not. The reality, especially now in the COVID-19 world, is our lives overlap our work entirely. We have children running around as we're trying to take conference calls. Our work, we just can't separate our work and our life. And I think that was true more than we wanted to admit, even in the pre-COVID world, and it will continue to be true in the post-COVID world, as we are all connected 100% of the time through our laptops, our phones, as work follows us around the clock. It's critically important that we also allow ourselves to be human, to take time for our families and the relationships in our lives that matter, and to prioritize those as well. When we stop connecting as humans and stop recognizing each other as human beings with thoughts and feelings and ideas and agency, we get the division and the divisiveness that we see breaking apart the United States today, and other parts of the world as well. I'm under no illusion that the political situation here is unique, because I think it's not.
Absolutely. It's become one big global village.
We're living in one big global village. What I do here in the United States affects you in South Africa and vice versa. And I think we need to stay attuned to that and aware of that. As we automate more things, it becomes really easy to go on Amazon and buy what I need. I might not need the human experience, the human interaction of going into a store for everything. Then it becomes even more important to find human connection and human contact in other parts of our lives, because without it, we fall apart.
Can we talk about how your processes are with regards to choosing who you work with? What data do you focus on? And, what is a winning pitch for you, if you were to just, summarize it like that?
Sure. So we get our hands on as much data as we can. We do that through a third-party data provider. The company that we chose originally was called Ocom Research, based out of Germany. They've been acquired by ISS. We picked them after combing through the data providers available at the time that were providing environmental, social, and governance data really carefully, looking at all of the underlying metrics that they were using and looking at and trying to understand who could give us the most comprehensive picture. We're investing in public companies, so we're relying on a whole variety of data sources, or our data providers relying on a whole variety of data sources. That includes self-reported data from the companies. Some of that is mandated by regulation. They are relying on data that's collected in some cases by third parties. Some of it they're buying from NGOs, often that are looking at specific issues and digging in deep. And they're doing a lot of data mining in the news, looking for controversies that surface and then how the companies handle those controversies, for example. And then they're collating and analyzing all of that data and developing it into metrics that we can then develop screening criteria based on. So we spent a lot of time really understanding what went into formulating those metrics. And then, unlike many other firms doing work somewhat similar to ours, we're not relying so much on the summary metrics that those companies provide, but actually on their underlying individual metrics in very specific issue areas. So we're now up to something over 100 different metrics that we are looking at across the spectrum of environmental and social and governance issues, to try and hone in on the things that we think are most material to a company's environmental, social, and governance performance, as well as to financial performance, because we think that those criteria are material to financial.
Really important, right?
So that's at a very high level how we go about doing our screening, and then we look at a whole variety of issue areas, kind of obvious ones from an environmental, social, governance standpoint, like fossil fuel exposure. We look at a variety of other pollutants. We look at carbon footprint. We look at land use and biodiversity issues. And on the social side, we look at human and labor rights issues, all the way down to, in the hospitality industry, we are looking at whether companies have policies and practices in place to train staff to identify and disrupt sex trafficking. So really a range of things, everything that we can find where there's sufficient data across a sufficient number of companies in our starting universe that we think is material and germane. But that brings me to really the crux of the issue, because we can't make decisions when there isn't sufficient data. And so there are some issues that we care about a lot that we aren't screening well right now because there isn't data available. One good example is one where we, instead of screening, are doing a shareholder advocacy push to increase access to data, and that is around median racial and gender pay equity. So pay gaps are a big problem here in the United States, and I think around the world. Women get paid on average much less than men do, and women of color, the difference is even bigger. If we could screen so that we invested in companies with smaller pay gaps, we might do that. We can't, because we don't know how, we can't identify which companies those are, because there's no transparency. The data just isn't available. Companies are notoriously closed about the details of their payroll. So instead, we're using our voice as investors to push companies to be more transparent, to make that data available. So we've reached out to every company in our portfolio to say, this is data that we need, this is data we think is material. We actually think if you do better at this, you will perform better as a company. It's good for you as a company because it reflects better diversity across all levels in the company. And the data shows that when you have better diversity throughout all levels of your company, you make better decisions and you perform better. So it's good for you to understand this about your company because you can make better decisions. It's good for your investors. And ultimately, if enough companies do it, it's good for everybody because it should lift salaries and help narrow those pay gaps. So that's a way that we can use our power as investors, even when we can't screen based on something that we're interested in.
All right, hi everyone. This is Miriam Davidovich again, and what I'd like to explore going forward is Dorit's work at Change Finance and the innovative financial products developed by Change Finance. So Dorit, can you tell me a bit about why it's important to completely redesign financial products for the public capital markets?
Sure, Miriam, I'd be happy to. So historically, it has been possible for the very wealthy to invest however they choose. And that means if they want to use values, their personal values, to drive investment decisions or to contribute to investment decisions, that has been possible because they have enough money, they can afford the research and the guidance from financial advisors to invest however they choose. So if you have enough money, you can tell your financial advisor, I don't want to invest in fossil fuels, so they will find a way to make that happen for you. Or I don't want to invest in companies that mistreat animals. They're going to have to go do a lot of work, but you're paying them well because you've got a lot of money invested with them. They'll go do the research. They'll figure out how to make that happen. But for most of us who don't have millions of dollars to invest, it's been really difficult to find ways to invest that align with our values. So one of the things we're doing at Change Finance is to try and create products and to drive the industry toward creating more products that are investable by ordinary people, that take those kinds of values into consideration, and that take a whole set of values into consideration, because we find that most people who care about animal welfare also care about climate change, and they also care about how women are treated by their employers, and they also care about a whole bunch of other things. And so we don't think they want to invest in something that addresses only one of the issues that they care about. So that's one piece of it, is making it possible for everybody across the financial spectrum to address to invest in ways that align with their values. The second piece is, we find that the factors that are values driven are actually material as well to performance. The data increasingly shows that companies that do better on environmental, social, and governance metrics also perform better. So we saw in the recent COVID-19 downturn earlier this year that the funds that were invested with ESG in mind outperformed. They didn't fall as much as regular index funds, for example. And if we look back historically, that has tended to be the case, that ESG funds have outperformed their competitors that don't keep ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues in mind. So we think that actually those values drivers are material. We can see it in a variety of ways. One that is near and dear to us at Change Finance, partly because of the framing of our first product, is fossil fuels. If you look at the history of fossil fuels, if you look back at coal, for example, a study was done showing that, I think it was the New York Pension Fund, if they had divested from coal 10 years ago, or the study may now be a year or two old, so maybe it was 10 or 11 or 12 years ago, they would have something like $10 billion more in the fund today. Coal was not a good investment then. It continues not to be a good investment now. Coal is on the decline. It's probably permanently on the decline. We see the same thing happening with oil and with natural gas, because the price of renewables is coming down to be competitive. Why would you invest in a new natural gas plant when it's cheaper and faster to build wind energy or solar energy? You wouldn't. The economics is driving a change, whether or not you personally care about climate change or believe in climate change. And so we look at the economic drivers and we see that there's alignment. On the social side, there's a steadily growing body of research that shows, for example, that workplace diversity at all levels of management correlates well with corporate performance, that companies that have better diversity, both in terms of race and gender on their boards and in their senior management, perform better. So why would you not want to use that as a factor in your investment decision making, both from a moral perspective and from a performance perspective?
Right.
You probably would. And so we see clear alignment in both ways, and we think everybody should have the opportunity to take advantage of that kind of decision making. The third leg is, just like we have seen in the past, consumer efforts drive change at corporations. One of my favorite stories is Walmart, who about 12 years ago, I think it was in 2008, made the decision that they were going to stop selling milk under their own brand name if it contained human growth hormone. And overnight, the milk industry in the United States changed. because no dairy farmer can afford not to sell milk to Walmart. And so dairy farms stopped using growth hormone. They had no choice. Well, one decision by a very large corporation made a fundamental change to the industry. It changed for the better. Now, there are some people who don't like that example because there were negative effects on some small farmers because it was hard to respond to the change, and maybe Walmart should have given them more warning or should have had supports in place to support small farmers, and all of that is true. It had corollary side effects. But ultimately, it made a really positive change in the industry that has persisted and that's affected, I think, probably the global dairy industry.
Absolutely.
One decision by one large corporation. That was driven by consumer demand. They saw growing consumer demand. They saw that people were buying milk without growth hormone. Increasingly, they didn't want to buy milk with growth hormone. Well, investors also have power. If investors make the choice to invest in companies that do X and don't do Y, if enough investors join that crowd, that also drives decision making. Companies are also motivated by things that drive share price and things that drive investor confidence and investor preference. And so that's another place where we can use our financial voice to have power. But we need the financial tools to do it. And so that's part of what we're trying to create.
The Impact Financial Integration Handbook was released earlier this year by the Impact Frontiers project of the Impact Management Project. And I would like to know, in terms of your work, how do you see the future of impact financial integration developing? Particularly because when it comes to attracting investor interest into ESG rated or sustainable funds, or really, making that value proposition around impact investing clear, the financial value proposition has to be there as well. So how do you see impact financial integration becoming more mainstream, and how do you see the process happening overall from handbook to tool?
Great. Yeah, I think we have seen that this is one of the fastest growing sectors certainly in public market investing, the ESG investing sector. And I don't anticipate that that's going to change anytime soon. One signal, for example, is the U.S. Department of Labor came out with a proposed new regulation a few months ago. The proposal was that they would restrict sponsors of retirement plans from utilizing ESG metrics as a factor. They were going to restrict them from offering ESG funds. There was some nuance to it, but basically that was the outcome. There's a regulatory requirement that proposed new regulations are open for public comment. They got thousands and thousands of comments during the, whatever it was, 30 days, 45 days, maybe, public comment period. 95% of them objected to the rule. The vast majority of the comments objected to the proposed rule because it made no sense, because there's huge demand. People want to be able to invest in ESG products through their retirement plans. ESG sponsors want to be able to offer those products both in response to demand and because they view ESG criteria as material to the financial performance of their products, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to offer the best performing products they can to people who participate in their requirement in their pension plans. So there's grave concern that this will decrease participation in workplace pension plans, which are the primary vehicle available to United States workers to save for retirement, or one of the primary vehicles. And that could be a real problem and put people really in grave financial risk down the road if they participate less than they otherwise would in these pension plans. and or the pension plans could underperform because they are now not allowed to offer products that their sponsors believe will actually be the best performing products, and that because they're unable to use materially germane criteria. So that's one example of a signal that this is here to stay, that mainstream investors are taking it seriously, that they believe that this is no longer a niche. It's something you do with a little bit of money on the side. People are really, the story has really changed. Even in the 4 years since we started Change Finance, I think the story has changed about the idea that I think was still fairly prevalent when we started the company, that you had to give up return in order to invest with impact. I think increasingly people realize that's not the case. In fact, maybe the opposite. So I don't think that I don't think that ESG investing is going to continue to be a side thing. I think it's increasingly those factors are going to become just part of investing, at least when we are talking about public market investing. And I think that we're going to see that filter downstream as well into earlier stage investing, that if diversity in senior management and on the board matters at a public company, why would it not matter in an early stage company? If we want big companies to measure their carbon footprint, and we use that, we think that's a valuable investment criteria for public companies, why would we not have our early stage companies build to measure that? And why would we not start thinking about that from the ground up? It won't happen overnight. It takes time for things to filter down and then percolate back up. But I think that we will see a trend in that direction, that increasingly what we historically have called impact investing and just plain old investing will continue to converge.
What would you like to see happen in terms of the investment priorities being set by advisors and their clients?
Great question. So I'm circling back to what I said about ESG, environmental social governance criteria, really being material to performance. What we've seen in our work at Change Finance is that there is still a lot of education to be done with financial advisors around that idea, around how to assess products that they might be thinking about using with their clients, about how to talk about it with their clients, about how to even start the conversation with their clients. You know, here in the United States, talking about money is pretty taboo. It's something that we're not really raised to be comfortable doing. That's not true in every part of the world. So, you know, my experience living in China was very different. I was pretty shocked the first time somebody asked me how much money I made. It's not a question you would ever be okay to ask somebody here in the United States. But we have to get more comfortable talking about money and the effects of money, the impacts that money and finance can have, because that enables us to ask better questions and have better conversations. And our financial advisors have a role to play in that. The more, you know, we talked very early on in this conversation about human touch, and this is a place where I think human touch matters. And there's been a move to robo-advisors and to automating the investment process that hasn't taken off, I think, as much as people imagined it would. And I think that's partly because human touch really matters here. Investment is a big, daunting process for most people. And the ability to have a conversation about what matters to you and how you can implement what matters to you through your financial decisions is very personal. So maybe financial advisors need less time. They need the time learning finance, but maybe they also need time learning new and different kinds of communication skills to pull more out of the technical aspects. And I'm thinking out loud a little bit here, but bring people in more, make those financial conversations more comfortable, where people can open up and talk about more about what matters to them, because then there are ways to implement those in your financial decision making. That's a place where there's probably work to be done and still tools to explore.
So I'd just like to also ask if there's anything else that you'd like to share with us. So what is your take on, the future of finance going forward? If you did have a crystal ball, if you did have a chance to design the world that you wanted to live in, the world that you believe we all deserve in terms of creating a future that reflects our values and your values in particular, what would that look like? So what would the future be like for you if you could create anything you wanted?
We need economic systems that keep money circulating in the economy. People that don't have a lot of money spend their money and keep it flowing in the economy. People that have more money than you can possibly spend don't. And that comes through a combination of regulation and taxation and financial systems that encourage recirculation and regeneration of capital. We're in, I think, a very stagnant type of system right now. I would look for programs, I'd look for shifts in regulation that shift the kinds of industry we invest in and we prioritize. So again, here in the US, we subsidize the most unhealthy forms of agriculture, for example, monoculture corn and monoculture soy, that are really just environmentally destructive. And I'd look for rethinking our subsidies to drive, to the extent that government subsidies make sense, to drive subsidy to things that are regenerative and healthy and create opportunity for more people to participate and that rebuild our world. So I think there's a big component for shifting priorities and regulation. Then there's a big component for shifting economic systems at all levels to create more opportunity for participation through the kind of work that Rosham is doing, creating economic opportunity for early stage companies, because those companies, some of them, scale and become then the kind of companies that eventually entities like Change Finance invest in public markets. And by choosing how we invest and choosing how you invest, we can create alignment across all of those asset classes so that we're all investing in companies that are driving towards a better world.
So simply by coming together around the topics of impact investing, regenerative economic development, and redesigning products for the public capital markets in alignment with our values is already a step in the right direction. And hopefully we can collaborate with and support ethical journalists and create a new paradigm and simply create what we want to see that isn't out there yet. So on that note, creating what we want to see happen for the world and really taking an active role in developing exactly what we believe is missing. Thank you so much for this today. We both learned a lot from you, and I think there's always the most to learn in hearing people's personal stories.